Hello and welcome back to the D3 Energy live stream. I am Greg Davis, the founder of D3 Energy, and welcome back to the series where I discuss conventional oil and gas in the United States and its resurgence and its place as part of America's hydrocarbon dominance. And I appreciate you coming back and spending some time with me today. Today I want to take a little trip back in history and talk about how America got to where we are today. How we became this hydrocarbon leader in the world today. So I'm going to go back and talk about where oil and gas is found. So if you go back and look at one of my videos, I focused on geologists and geophysicists, the oil finders in our industry. And as I said, and this was a quote from the great Wallace Pratt, who was one of the great geologic minds in our history. His quote was, "Oil is first found in the minds of men." And it's our industry today, the professionals the men and women, the oil finders in our business today, that is going to continue to lead this resurgence of America's energy dominance, this paradigm shift. But it was these great men in our history, these great visionaries in our history, that started it all. They built the foundation. And so in this upcoming series, I'm going to talk about some of these great visionaries, these leaders, these pioneers, these men who essentially created our industry from nothing. So today we're going to talk about the wildcatters. Let me go way back to 1858. The first oil well in the United States was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And it was drilled by a man named Colonel Edwin Drake, who had a company called the Seneca Oil and Gas Company. And people knew there was oil and gas there because oil seeps would be seen, and people would go collect the oil and use it for medicinal purposes. But it was Edwin Drake who drilled the first oil well and essentially started the whole industry. And then it was from there that the likes of John D. Rockefeller, one of the biggest, greatest, wealthiest oil men in our history, who essentially took over wells like those in Pennsylvania and in other places around that state, and basically harvested all the oil, controlled all the oil, and then went on to essentially control 80% of America's oil and gas. And he was as people said, he was a monopolist, and he created a monopoly on oil. And at the time, in the late 1800s, people thought there was only oil in Pennsylvania, and that once that ran out, that was it. Fast forward and move south to Texas, and in a town called Beaumont. And there was a man there named Patillo Higgins, who is responsible for having found the greatest gusher of all time. Patillo Higgins was a sheriff who lived in this town in the late 1800s. And he had a vision. There was a mound south of town called Sulphur Mound. And it was a little mound on the prairie. Things are pretty flat in Texas. But there was this little hill. And they called it the Hill, or Spindletop Hill it was called. And people would go there and they would smell sulfur and, you know, sometimes see little flashes of light. And Patillo Higgins, who wasn't a technical guy, he had no formal education, but he had heard about oil and gas, and he thought that there was a huge oil and gas treasure, a vast ocean of oil underneath the hill. And nobody believed him. And he was a bit of a dreamer. He was also a bit of a criminal. He got in trouble one time. He got into a scrape as a kid, and he shot a sheriff and killed him. And the sheriff shot him, and he lost his arm. Well, he ended up getting off. But he was kind of known as this wild guy. But he managed to pull together some money in the late 1800s and got some people to back him in drilling some wells. And back then, drilling was very crude, basically pounding on the ground and trying to dig the earth out. And they got down about 400 feet, 500 feet, and on several attempts he completely lost everything and essentially ran out of money. But he kept up with his vision. He just kept saying to himself, there is oil under here, we just haven't gone deep enough, we just haven't found it. So he went off and he found a guy who at the time was one of the geologists for the United States, and his name was Captain Lucas. And Captain Lucas knew about these things called salt domes, where the salt comes up under the earth and pushes the earth up, creating these formations for the oil to trap. And Lucas had been studying these formations, and he believed Patillo when nobody else did. And they drilled a well or two, but they didn't work. And then Lucas went off looking for money, and he went to people like John D. Rockefeller, and he went to Pittsburgh to find the money. And just about everybody turned them down. They said, these guys in Texas, these oil guys, they say there's no oil in Texas. These guys are like wild men. They're like wildcats. You know, they think there's oil there. There's no oil there. Hence the term wildcatters. So Lucas eventually convinces a couple of gentlemen in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, to back his efforts. But in doing the deal, Patillo Higgins was cut out of the deal. And ultimately it is Patillo who was credited for finding this great field I'll tell you about next. But he really didn't make hardly any money because he had to keep selling and selling, and he ran out of money. But it was his vision. Lucas recruited a couple of guys who knew how to drill wells and brought them in. And for a year, they pounded on the ground on that hill. And everybody watched. It became, somewhat of a joke in the community. There was also a lot of interest. And again, people like Rockefeller and the other oil men in the East said, no way, these guys will never find oil. And Rockefeller, remember, controlled all the oil. Well, in 1901, January 10th, after working for over a year, pounding on the ground, drilling, Captain Lucas and his team struck oil. Not only did they strike oil, they hit a geyser. They hit a geyser the likes of nothing ever seen. and hence the term oil gusher, a gusher. Oil was gushing out of the ground. The ground rumbled and thundered. People in the town could hear it, could feel it. And when they hit that formation, the oil exploded out of the ground and shooting the oil 150 feet in the air. Eureka. The wildcatters found oil in Texas, and it sent shockwaves across the country. Word got back to the likes of John D. Rockefeller, who had thought, there's no way there's any oil down here. It got back to him and people on the East Coast and people in Pennsylvania, and it set off a boom where the population of Beaumont went from 10,000 people to 50,000. And hundreds of little oil companies were started, and people flocked to the area to find oil. In that moment, that 100,000 barrel a day gusher known as the Spindletop Gusher, the geyser of oil. In that moment, the world of oil changed. Suddenly, America was flush with oil, and it set off a boom in Texas that rivaled anything going on anywhere in the world. And people like John D. Rockefeller, many people credit his demise with him not having the foresight, and the men in the East, the industrialists, not having the foresight that there could be oil somewhere else, that these wildcatters were crazy. But it was these wildcatters that changed the industry. It was these wildcatters that essentially built America's oil and gas industry today. And from that geyser of oil, from that Lucas gusher, the American modern oil and gas industry began in real, and companies like Exxon and Gulf Oil spun out of that field. It was because of one guy, one man who had a vision and believed in it. No matter what, he knew it. And he did everything that he could, even to the point where he didn't even own any of that field. He ended up making some money from it, and later on became an oil man and found oil in other places. But he died broke. But he had a vision. It was his vision, and it's the vision of people like Patillo Higgins and Captain Lucas and the men and women who believed in themselves and had a hard work ethic and truly felt that there was something great to do, that America is where it is today. And so, why is this important? Because today, our industry owes its beginnings, owes its foundation, owes its roots to people like Patillo Higgins and Captain Lucas. And there's many others. From that giant discovery, the Gulf Coast and Texas became the place for oil and gas. And everybody went searching to find those wildcatters and to drill wells. And it set off America's big oil and gas revolution at the time. And that's what's going to happen today. America is awash with oil today, as I have been talking to you about. And it's awash in oil, and we have more to find and more to get because we have people like Patillo Higgins. Again, the men and women in our industry who know where to find that oil and gas and believe it. And there are people who are willing to take risks to prove themselves to find that oil. And that's how America is going to continue its dominance, its hydrocarbon dominance, today, tomorrow, and for the next decades. And so, that's the story about Patillo Higgins, Captain Lucas, and the great Spindletop oil discovery, the gusher, the wildcatters. And there's many more wildcatters that I'm going to talk about. And over the next week, I'm going to share about other great oil men who came along. People like H.L. Hunt, who discovered the East Texas oil field. And people like my father, Marvin Davis, who got his advice from H.L. Hunt, who set off and became one of the great wildcatters. I'll be talking about him, which is one of my favorite subjects. H.L. Hunt, Marvin Davis. We'll talk about people like Boone Pickens and others. People like Harold Hamm today, who have found the great Bakken oil field in North Dakota. And George Mitchell, who set off the shale revolution. And we'll talk about others. So I appreciate you taking a little time today with me on my stroll here. And please share this. We had bad reception there. Please share this video with your friends and help me, help us, help our industry, help America keep winning this hydrocarbon revolution. We have so much oil and gas here to be found, and it's so important for our economy. It's so important for America's position on the world stage. Help me, help us to continue to build and grow and keep making America great. I'm Greg Davis. Thanks for taking time with me today, and we'll see you next time.